How are you guys doing? Thank you very much, Lester. I appreciate it. As Lester mentioned, I'm not a real scientist, as I like to think of myself. I'm not a hard scientist. I studied electrical engineering at the Naval Academy. Then I went to technology and policy at MIT, and then I did 6 years in the Marine Corps, after which I got out about a year ago, and here I am, one of the owners of the Tin Pan. So I'm very excited to have you all here. Cindy approached me and I said, yes, we have to do this, we have to make this work, because I actually do care, not just as an owner, so thanks for buying my food and drink, that's great. But because I care about the science about it. I kind of consider myself a citizen scientist. While I was in the Marine Corps, I wrote a book about craft cocktails, which doesn't sound like a sciencey thing until you start thinking about ethanol and polar and non-polar solvents and distillation, and you're like, oh, okay, this is kind of like science. So I'm going to give you a very quick shot of cocktail science, mostly from the book, just for a few minutes, and then we're going to do a little bit of applied science. So whenever we talk about science, I like to think we observe, we ask a question, we research. If we have the chance, we do experimentation, and then we apply what we've learned. So I'm going to tell you a quick little story. So what I observed was that all these cocktail books that I had read, all these authors talk about something called bitters. It's an ingredient that you use in just a dash of in a drink. And the question I had was, well, what does it do? And all these books said, oh, it helps to round a drink out. It helps to make the flavors kind of blend together. And I said, well, that's not good enough for me. I don't know what that really means. So my research question was, what do bitters actually do from a science perspective? So with that question in mind, I started doing my research. And what I found out, people probably in the room probably think, well, taste buds, they're scattered around your tongue. And some areas that taste salty, some areas that taste acid, some areas that taste bitterness. Sort of, not entirely. It turns out that every taste bud in your mouth can taste all 5 of the basic tastes. That's sweet, bitter, sour, salty, and umami is one of the ones that's, savory is kind of the ones that they talk about that no one's really sure if it really exists, but people tend to agree now that it might be the 5th taste. So that was one interesting insight, that all these tastes do actually all play together in your tongue. You can't turn one part of it off. So then the question still remained, well, how do they all play together? And so I found a very interesting paper where, please don't stare at the graph, I'm going to explain what it means in a second. And what they did is they actually had all these respondents taste different concentrations, some with just sugar water, some with just citric acid, some with just bitterness, quinine, some with just salt. They skipped umami, they didn't go into that. And they said, well, how does it affect when you combine these different tastes together? Well, as you would think, well, if I had a sugary solution and I put bitterness into it, it would just make it more bitter, right? I mean, if you add things together, you're going to get the sum. Well, that's not actually what happens. As it turns out, and this I found very interesting and surprising, when you combine the basic tastes, they actually have a mutually suppressive effect. And that's across the board. So if you add salt to sour, it makes it less salty and less sour, believe it or not. And you can look at it, this is what it's showing basically. So if you look at just let's look at just the bottom right graph. A purely bitter solution, which is on the far left, if you were to add sucrose to it, it's less bitter. If you were to add salt to it, it's less bitter. If you add any combination of any of the other basic tastes, the entire thing becomes less bitter. It's a mutually suppressive effect. Add to that, this is from a different paper, that these are the relative intensities. I'm sorry, that's a unitless graph, don't kill me. These are the relative intensities of the 4 basic tastes that were measured. And as you can see, a tiny, tiny bit of any sort of bitterness has a dramatically equivalent effect, basically, to a much larger amount of sugar. So basically, when you put those 2 dashes of bitter, it's like, does this really do anything? And the answer is yes. Yes, it does. And I actually kind of just answered my question just by reading a couple papers. I actually interviewed the scientist who wrote the papers too, so that helped. But the question was essentially answered, and that was, yeah, it does round out the drinks. It just mutually suppresses all those harsh flavors. So that was interesting. That was kind of good, or I found that out. But what was actually really interesting too was, if you look at this, oh yeah, that too. If you look at that graph again on the far right, what you'll notice is that bitterness is the most suppressed by a combination of salt and sugar. So this is where we get to the applied part. So what's interesting about science is you ask questions, you research it, you find an answer, but then you actually learn other things you didn't expect to learn, right? So what this showed is that bitterness is suppressed by a combination of salt and sugar the most. That's how you suppress the most bitterness. So how do we apply that? Well, the special drink that we have tonight is called the salted caramel whiskey sour. And let me tell you about how I do that. What I do, I don't make a true caramel. I don't use butter, I don't use milk, because if you put butter and milk into a cocktail, it gets crazy, and you don't want to do that. So what I do is actually very carefully heat up sugar in a pan to about 350 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. a browning reaction occurs. If anyone's heard of Maillard reactions, this is a browning reaction, so it doesn't include proteins, but basically the sugars break down and reform into new particles, and they're nutty, bitter, and burnt tasting. So a very specific temperature, you get this, add water to that, and you get burnt sugar syrup is what I like to call it. And as an aside, you can actually measure very carefully the flavor profile that you want based on the temperature. So I have like a little laser thermometer, and that's how I do it. So let me walk you through this drink, and I'll show you how to make it real quick. Nikki, if I could get my ice. Thank you. This is an ounce and a half of the caramel syrup. We're going to put in an ounce of rye whiskey. Yours drinks will be made of bourbon by default, but I like rye. It's a little bit more mellow, a little more citrusy. Dash of bitters. I'm about to clean your tablecloth. I'm sorry, Cynthia. Squeeze of lemon juice. Then we're going to shake this. As I mentioned, y'all can order the drink. It's on the menu for the night. It's $8 for the drink. What I would recommend you do is I would normally salt this. I'm not going to salt it. What I recommend you do is actually you all have salt shakers at your tables. If you want to try it, you can just salt yourself. If you don't want to spend money on a drink, which is perfectly acceptable, then I'll go make a batch essentially of the non-alcoholic, and it'll just be the caramel syrup and some lemon juice, and you can grab some of that. Just come to the bar and you can grab little samples. You can try salting yourself just to see how the flavor changes. And with that, I'm done. Thank you so much.
That one's not on. I don't know why. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank Kevin so much for that. So, you've learned about the 4 flavors of parent: sweetness, sour, bitterness, and the 4th. So, we see that they all have equal contributions to making a tasty cocktail like the one I currently have. What questions does anybody have about the science that Kevin has just shown? Yes?
Not necessarily the science, but the imagination behind it. Where did you come up with this particular type of drink? 'Cause I just had one and it's fantastic. Did everybody hear that?
Yeah. Glowing reviews already. So her question was, where did he come up with it? The creativity behind the drink.
Actually, it's the browning reactions that made a lot of sense. If you look at the way that whiskey gets its flavor, it's actually, most whiskeys are stored. Yeah, I'm not gonna be able to use that.
Okay. Yeah, no, we can just trade back.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, that wireless mic is just not cooperating. If you look at the way that whiskey is made, it's stored in toasted oak barrels, and the toasting process will actually break down the lignins, which are complex carbohydrates in the barrels, and that'll create some sugars and some of those browning, like brown flavors essentially. And so people like that taste, obviously, because they like whiskey. And so I said, well, how do I do that, at home? So that's kind of where it came from.
Yes.
What is in bitter? What's the ingredient in that?
So the question was, what is bitters? What is in it? What's it composed of?
There are a number of different types of bitters. Quinine is one of the most common ingredients. It's a bittering agent. Quinine sulfate is what they use in the test. If you ever get a gin and tonic at this bar, we make our own tonic because I buy cinchona bark. Yeah, just kidding. Cinchona bark, which is where quinine comes from, cinchona, quinine, and we steep and make a tea, and that's where that comes from. But basically, bitters is extracted from sometimes quinine, gentian, dandelion root. There's all many different things that go into it.
You have a green?
Did you do any sort of experimentation with the proportions? Because there's some pretty typical recipes, sour versus alcohol versus.
So did he change the ratio as he was going through and coming up with the recipe?
Ratio is kind of the hardest chapter to write, and I do have it in there, and we looked at kind of how things change, but it turns out that It really depends on the customer, and it turns out that people will taste things very differently from each other. So some people are going to taste things more sour and some more sweet. You actually have to spend a little time and get to know your customers and see exactly what they like. But it's very subtle, and you just kind of have to balance it. But there are some set ratios, but they're just little tweaks you can make.
Got time for 2 more. So you?
James Bond question, when do you shake, when do you stir?
The James Bond question, age-old, shaken versus stirred. What's actually correct?
This was much more relevant back in the day, because back in the day, simple syrups were usually made of gum syrup. And gum syrup is something that was made of gum arabic, was a thickened syrup. And the reason this is relevant, because if you shook something like a whiskey sour with gum syrup rather than simple syrup, it would actually suspend those air particles in the drink for much longer. You get a frothy mouthfeel for a much longer time. And that's the main reason you shake, to get the mouthfeel and then incorporate, the lemon juice and all that into it as well. But generally speaking, if you have just spirits, so for example, martini, because that would be a vermouth, bitters traditionally, and gin, you would stir that because there's no reason to shake it.
One more? Well, I had one question. So you mentioned that you chose to go with the rye versus different types. Did you try with other types and find that you got a different flavor profile versus the other, or was it just personal preference?
The best part of my job is trial and error.
All right. Well, thank Kevin so much. And cheers for that. Please feel free to get one at the bar.